The 48th floor of the Thorne and Associates building didn't just overlook the city, it judged it. From his floor-to-ceiling windows, Alpheus Thorne watched the grid of Manhattan flicker to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, ushering in the blue hour, that bruised transitional time of day when the sky turned the color of a fresh shadow. Al lived his life in a palette of slate, navy, and charcoal. His office was a masterpiece of clinical perfection, a glass desk devoid of photographs, a single obsidian sculpture, and blueprints that were hailed as the future of urban design. At 32, he was a prodigy of iron and glass, the youngest senior partner in the firm's century-long history. The critics called his work ethereal, but his employees called him the iceberg. He was a man who functioned with the silent, deadly efficiency of a glacier, cold, beautiful, and impossible to move. He was also the man who never stayed for the celebration. "Al, for the love of God, stay for just one scotch," Marcus, his boisterous partner, had pleaded an hour ago, blocking the doorway with a wide grin. "The mayor is downstairs. The investors for the riverfront project are practically salivating to shake the hand that designed the Thorne span. It's your night." "The bridge is held up by physics, Marcus, not by my presence at a cocktail party," Al replied. His voice was a low, flat monotone that acted as a social guillotine. He didn't look up as he tucked a $400 silk scarf into the collar of his bespoke overcoat. "If the bridge speaks, they'll hear it. I have nothing to add." He walked out before Marcus could argue, the click of his Italian leather boots echoing like a countdown in the marble hallway. Outside, the city was a different beast. A record-breaking polar vortex had gripped the coast, dragging the temperature down to a lethal 10 degrees. The wind didn't just blow, it hunted. It searched for the gaps in scarves, the frayed edges of sleeves, and the skin left exposed. Al decided to walk the 4 blocks to the garage where his SUV was parked. His driver had offered to pull around to the front, but Al had waved him off. He liked the cold. To Al, the cold was the only thing in New York that didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be your friend. It didn't want a favor or a promotion. It was honest. It demanded respect or it took your life. He turned into the narrow alleyway behind the old textile warehouse, a shortcut he had used for months. The smell hit him first. The sharp ozone tang of incoming snow mixed with the heavy, sour scent of wet brick and ancient garbage. The alley was a canyon of shadows, lit only by the flickering orange glow of a distant street lamp. Then he saw the shape. Tucked into the jagged alcove of a disused loading dock was a mound of discarded life. At first glance, it looked like a pile of trash bags, but then the mound shuddered. Al froze. His breath hitched in his throat, coming out in a thick white plume that vanished into the darkness. Draped over the figure's shivering shoulders was a gray polyester blanket with 2 distinct faded white stripes at the hem. The sight was like a physical blow to Al's chest. He felt the phantom weight of that same cheap fibers blanket against his own skin from a decade ago. He knew the exact cheap feel of those synthetic fibers. He knew they didn't actually generate heat. They were designed by city committees to be just enough to keep a body from dying, but never enough to make it feel warm. They trapped the dampness of the breath and the sweat of the fever until the fabric became a heavy, frozen shroud. "You," Al said. The word was sharper than he intended, echoing off the brick walls like a gunshot. The mound of rags flinched violently. A pair of hands, cracked, gray with grime, and trembling so hard they looked blurred, clutched the blanket tighter. "Moving," a voice croaked. It was a hollow, rattling sound, the voice of someone whose throat had been scoured by wood smoke and frost. I'm moving. Just 5 minutes, please. The wind, it's a knife out there." Al didn't move. He couldn't. He was staring at the man's hands. Under the dirt, the fingernails were bitten to the quick, and the knuckles were swollen with the beginning of frostbite. These were the hands of a man who had fought the concrete and was losing. "You're not moving," Al said, his voice losing its clinical edge and dropping into a raw, jagged register. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirty slush. The man finally looked up. Al's breath caught again.
The man's face was a map of human wreckage. His beard was matted with ice, his skin was chopped to a raw, angry red, and a bruise darkened one temple. But his eyes, they were impossible. They were a deep, vibrant amber, like twin embers glowing in the heart of a dying campfire. They were eyes that didn't belong to a shadow. They belonged to someone who still had a soul worth saving. "I don't have anything," the man whispered, his teeth chattering so loudly Al could hear them. "No money, nothing for you to take." Al didn't think about his 7 a.m. meeting with the board. He didn't think about the social scandal of a billionaire architect dragging a vagrant into his private vehicle. He thought about a night 12 years ago, when he had stood in this exact same alley, staring at the high-lit windows of the rich and wondering if any of them knew that the air down here tasted like iron. "My name is Al," he said, and for the first time in years, the iceberg crocked. His voice was a whisper, but it was the steadiest thing in the alley. "And you are coming with me. If you stay here, the city will find you tomorrow morning, and they'll put you in a bag without ever knowing your name." The man, Daniel, looked at Al's charcoal coat, the perfect knot of his tie, and the face that looked as though it had been carved from the very marble Al used in his lobbies. He looked like a god who had descended into the pits of hell. "Why?" Daniel gasped, a single tear freezing on his cheek before it could fall. "Why me?" Al's jaw tightened. He felt the cold rising from the pavement, trying to claim them both. "Because," Al said, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed memory, "because I still have that same gray blanket in a box at the bottom of my closet. I know the stripes, Daniel. I know what it's like to count them until the sun comes up. Now get up." The shock of Al knowing his situation, knowing the blanket, did what the threat of death couldn't. It sparked a flicker of curiosity in Daniel's amber eyes. Daniel tried to rise, but his legs were leaden. He began to tilt to the side, the gray blanket sliding into the oily slush. Al didn't hesitate. He stepped into the filth of the loading dock, ruining his $2,000 boots without a second thought. He reached out, his gloved hands catching Daniel by the shoulders. Even through the layers of tattered flannel and the smell of the streets, Al could feel the man's frame vibrating with a deep, systemic chill. It was a vibration that traveled up Al's arms and settled in his own bones. "I've got you," Al murmured, his breath warm against Daniel's frozen ear. "Come on, let's get you out of the dark." As Al guided the shivering man toward the sleek, idling SUV at the mouth of the alley, Al felt the city watching them. The 48th floor was still up there, cold and perfect, but for the first time in his life, Alpheus Thorne was glad to be exactly where he was, on the ground, holding on to someone who was still warm. The interior of the SUV was a sensory overload of leather, cedarwood, and technology. Al reached over and dialed the seat heaters to their maximum setting. Beneath Daniel, the leather began to radiate a fierce, artificial heat. The drive was conducted in a heavy, pressurized silence. Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. His body had begun the thaw, the agonizing process where blood finally returns to frozen extremities. He leaned his head against the window, watching the Fifth Avenue boutiques blur by. To the rest of the world, those windows displayed diamonds and mannequins draped in silk. To Daniel, they were just taunting reflections of a ghost. He looked at his own image in the glass, haggard, soot-stained, and broken, and then at Al, who sat beside him like a silent sentinel of another world. When they reached the penthouse, the elevator ride felt like an ascent to another planet. The walls were mirrored, polished to a high, unforgiving shine. Daniel stared at his boots, the cracked leather held together by fraying twine, and then at the pristine white marble floor. He felt like a tear in a masterpiece, a smudge of charcoal on a clean blueprint. He kept his arms pulled tight against his chest, trying to take up as little space as possible. The doors slid open directly into a foyer that breathed wealth. "Inside," Al said. His voice was no longer the sharp blade it had been in the alley. It was something softer, a low vibration that grounded Daniel's fluttering panic. The apartment was vast and terrifyingly silent. It was a masterpiece of cold design, gray stone floors that looked like frozen smoke, white walls that offered no comfort, and floor-to-ceiling glass that turned the city into a glittering circuit board. It was a home designed for a man who didn't want to be touched. Daniel took 2 steps onto the polished floor and stopped dead. He looked down at the dark, wet tracks his boots were leaving on the white stone. "I'll ruin it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The dirt, Al, I'm covered in the street. I shouldn't be here." Al didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at the mud. He moved closer, his hand hovering near Daniel's shoulder but not quite touching, giving him the space he hadn't had in months. "Everything in this house is replaceable, Daniel," Al said, his blue eyes locking onto Daniel's amber ones with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You are not. Dirt washes off stone. It doesn't wash off the soul unless you let it. Go into the bathroom, second door on the left." Al walked ahead and opened the door, revealing a bathroom that was larger than the shelter's entire dormitory. "There are towels in the cabinet. There is soap that smells like sandalwood. Stay in the water until you stop shaking. I don't care if you stay in there for 3 hours, just stop shaking." As the heavy door clicked shut and the pipes began to groan with the weight of the hot water, Al finally let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 10 years. Al went to his bedroom. He bypassed his suits and starched shirts, reaching instead for the softest things he owned: thick cashmere sweatpants and a heavy charcoal wool sweater. He laid them out on the bed with a precision that bordered on reverence. In the kitchen, Al realized how hollow his own life was. His refrigerator contained 3 bottles of sparkling water, a jar of expensive mustard, and a tray of catered hors d'oeuvres from a gala he hadn't attended. But in the back of the pantry, he found what he was looking for: a tin of high-quality tomato soup and a loaf of sourdough bread he'd bought on a whim. He put the soup on the stove. As it began to bubble, the deep red liquid looked like lava against the white pot. The scent, salty, sweet, and warm, began to cut through the sterile scent of the apartment. 40 minutes later, the bathroom door opened. Daniel emerged, and for a moment, Al forgot how to breathe. Without the layers of tattered flannel and the grime of the city, Daniel looked smaller, but also more vital. He was live, his muscles corded and lean from years of hard labor and hunger. His skin was flushed a deep pink from the heat, and his dark chestnut hair was damp, curling stubbornly at the nape of his neck. He was wearing Al's clothes. The sweater was too big, the sleeves swallowing his hands, making him look vulnerable in a way that made Al's chest ache. "The water," said Daniel, his voice finally clear, rich, and unexpectedly melodic. "I forgot water could be that hot. I forgot you could stay in it until you felt your pulse again." "Sit," Al commanded, though it sounded more like an invitation. He pointed to the marble kitchen island. Daniel sat, his hands hovering over the steaming bowl of soup as if it were a holy relic he wasn't allowed to touch. When he finally took a sip, his eyes fluttered shut. A small, involuntary moan of relief escaped his throat, a sound so raw and honest that it made Al turn away for a second to compose himself. "Thank you," Daniel whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Al said, sitting across from him. He watched Daniel eat, a strange, tight feeling forming in his chest. For years, this kitchen had been a vacuum, a place for function, not life. Now, the steam of the soup and the scent of Daniel's clean, damp skin were filling the space, rewriting the geometry of the room. "You said you had the blanket," Daniel said after a long silence. He was tearing the sourdough bread, using it to catch the last drops of red soup. He looked at Al with a sudden, piercing clarity. How does a man in a place like this know a blanket from a shelter? Al leans back, his eyes fixed on the city lights that felt so far away. 10 years ago, I wasn't the iceberg. I was 22, and I was nobody. My parents died in a car accident when I was 18. No insurance, no savings, just a mountain of debt they'd hidden. I spent 2 winters in the municipal system. I worked 3 jobs during the day, construction, dishwashing, whatever, and I went to school at night. I slept on the floor of the public library when the shelters were over capacity because I knew the security guard's schedule. The iceberg. That's what the rags call you, right? Alpheus Thorne, the man who builds the future out of glass because he's afraid of the earth. Al flinched. The accuracy of the statement cut deeper than any critic's review. They're not wrong. I built this place to be a fortress. I wanted a life where the weather couldn't touch me. They are wrong, Daniel said. He reached across the marble island. He didn't touch Al's hand, not yet, but he held his own hand just an inch away. Al could feel the heat radiating from Daniel's skin, a living, pulsing warmth that made the stone floor feel brittle. You're not made of ice, Al. You're just built to withstand it. There's a difference. That night, for the first time in a decade, Al didn't dream of falling. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled, rhythmic sounds of Daniel's breathing in the guest room. The apartment didn't feel like a vault anymore. It felt like a foundation, something solid, something deep, and something that was, finally, slowly, starting to hold heat. The 3rd month arrived with a softening of the sky. The brutal, jagged ice of January had surrendered to a persistent, misty rain that signaled the very beginning of a hesitant spring. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere had shifted from a guarded truce to a choreographed dance. Daniel was no longer a ghost in the guest room. He had become a pulse. He had discovered Al's terrace, a barren concrete slab, and within weeks it was crowded with hardy winter pansies and terracotta pots of dormant herbs. Daniel's hands were always slightly stained with damp earth now, a stark contrast to the sterile white and chrome world Al inhabited. "You're staring again," Daniel said one Tuesday evening. He was kneeling on the floor, sketches of a public garden spread out before him. Al was standing by the window, a glass of wine forgotten in his hand. "I'm looking at the way you use light," Al lied. Daniel looked up, a playful smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He stood up, crossing the room with a fluid grace that still made Al's heart skip. He stopped inches from Al, the scent of rain and rosemary clinging to his skin. "You've been working for 16 hours, Al. Your eyes are bloodshot and your shoulders are up to your ears. You need to leave this building." "I have a deadline for the Civic Center," Al protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "The building won't fall down if you take one night off," Daniel whispered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Al's temple, smoothing a stray hair back. The touch was lingering, purposeful. "I want to show you something. Not my world and not yours, something in between." Al let himself be led. They drove to the edge of the city, where the industrial district met the parklands. Al pulled the car up to a massive Victorian-era structure of wrought iron and glass, the city conservatory. "It's closed, Daniel," Al said, looking at the darkened entrance. "Not for the man who designed the new wing," Daniel grinned, pulling a heavy brass key from his pocket. "The head gardener and I have been talking. He knows I'm a friend of yours." They stepped inside and the world changed. The roar of the city was replaced by a heavy, humid silence. The air was thick, smelling of crushed hibiscus, wet moss, and ancient soil. It was nearly 80 degrees inside, a tropical fever dream in the middle of a gray March. "This is where I used to hide when things were bad. Before the shop went under, I'd come here just to remind myself that things could still grow." They reached the center of the palm house. A massive lily pond sat under the dome, the moon shining through the glass and reflecting off the dark water. The heat was intoxicating. Al felt his layers, the suit, the reputation, the iceberg armor, starting to peel away. "Al," Daniel said softly. Al turned. Daniel was standing close, the heat curling his dark hair. In the dim light, his amber eyes were wide, searching. When you found me, Daniel began, his voice trembling slightly, I thought you were just another rich man looking for a project, a way to feel good about himself. But I've watched you. I've seen the way you look at the city. You don't want to build monuments. You want to build shelters. Al felt a lump in his throat. I just don't want anyone else to be cold, Daniel. Daniel stepped into Al's space, his chest brushing against Al's. He reached up, his warm palms cupping Al's face. It was the first time they were truly, undeniably intimate. The air between them was thick with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken weight of the last 3 months. You're so warm, Al whispered, leaning into the touch. That's because I'm with you, Daniel replied. The kiss was slow, a gradual melting. It started with a hesitant press of lips and grew into something deep and hungry. Al's hands found Daniel's waist, pulling him flush against him. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was a recognition. Two men who had known the deepest chill, finally finding the hearth.
The weeks following the night in the conservatory were a blur of domestic intimacy and professional intensity. The iceberg hadn't just cracked, he'd begun to reshape his entire world around the man he had found in the alley. Al spent his mornings at the firm, navigating a world of cold calculations and steel beams, but his mind was always back at the penthouse. He found himself rushing through meetings, dismissing architects who lacked soul, and heading home while the sun was still high. In the evenings, the dining table, once a sterile slab of Italian marble, had become a war room. It was covered in vellum sketches, soil samples, and topographical maps of the Hudson shoreline. Daniel was a man possessed. He was working on a formal proposal for the Riverfront Restoration Project, the city's most ambitious green space initiative in 50 years. The City Planning Committee, they don't see it, Al, Daniel grumbled one Tuesday night. He rubbed his eyes, his fingers stained with the graphite of a dozen discarded drafts. He looked at a site map with a scowl. They want concrete bulkheads and wrought iron benches. They want a park that looks like a museum. But the river is alive. It's a breathing thing. It needs roots to hold the soil. It needs weeping willows to shade the water and bioswales to filter the city's runoff before it chokes the fish. Al walked behind him, his steadying force a tone. He placed his hands on Daniel's shoulders, shoulders that were no longer skeletal, but filling out with healthy muscle. He began kneading the knots of tension there, his thumbs finding the tight muscles at the base of Daniel's neck. Then tell them that, Al said, his voice a low, resonant hum. Architecture isn't about giving people what they ask for, Daniel. It's about giving them what they need but don't have the vocabulary to request. Daniel sighed, a ragged sound, and leaned his head back against Al's stomach. He looked up at Al, the amber in his eyes clouded with a flicker of the old doubt. I don't have a degree from an Ivy League, Al. I don't have a portfolio of skyscrapers. I'm just a guy who once ran a failing flower shop and spent 3 months sleeping on a steam grate. Why would they listen to me? Al stopped his movements, his hands sliding down to rest firmly over Daniel's chest, feeling the strong, steady thrum of his heart. You're a man who survived, Al said, his voice dropping into a register of fierce conviction. And I've seen your sketches, Daniel. I've seen the way you understand how a person feels when they stand in the wind. Your designs aren't just beautiful, they're necessary. They're the antidote to the glass cages I've been building for a decade. Al didn't just offer moral support. He became Daniel's architect of opportunity. He used every ounce of his hard-earned influence to secure Daniel a seat at the preliminary hearing, a seat usually reserved for firms with 50 years of history. But the real work happened in the quiet hours of the night. Al became Daniel's coach, his critic, and his biggest advocate. He stood in the living room while Daniel practiced his presentation, teaching him how to command a room of skeptics. Lower your voice, Al would say, pacing the room like a panther. Don't rush the explanation of the root systems. Let the silence do the work. Make them feel the absence of the trees before you show them the sketch. Command the space, Daniel. You aren't asking for permission to exist, you're offering them a vision they can't afford to lose. Daniel would nod, his eyes locked on Al's, absorbing the strength Al was pouring into him. They were no longer rescuer and rescued. They were a team. The night of the final submission was a fever dream of red-eyed focus. The deadline was 4 a.m. At 2:45 a.m., the apartment was silent, save for the hum of Al's high-powered computer and the scratching of Daniel's pen as he made one last adjustment to the drainage schematics. The air was thick with the scent of cold coffee and the electric charge of shared purpose. When the upload complete bar finally turned green at 3:12 a.m., the silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a battle ended. Daniel slumped back in the chair, his face pale with exhaustion, his hair a chaotic mess of dark curls. He turned to Al, his eyes bright with a mixture of terror and triumph. "Whatever happens tomorrow or next month," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, taking Al's hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at Al's wrist. "Thank you. For the room, for the soup, for seeing me when I was invisible." Al didn't answer with words. He couldn't. The iceberg had long since melted into something much more vulnerable. He took Daniel's hand and led him toward the bedroom. That night, the intimacy was different. It wasn't the desperate, humid heat of the greenhouse or the frantic discovery of their first time. It was a slow, quiet building of a foundation. In the silver moonlight that spilled across the bed, Al traced the line of Daniel's jaw with a reverence usually reserved for sacred blueprints. They moved together with a rhythmic assurance, a familiarity that felt as though it had been written into their DNA years ago. Every touch was a confirmation. You are here. You are safe. You are mine. Al felt the weight of Daniel's body against his, the warmth of his skin, and the steady breath that fanned across his collarbone. For the first time, Al didn't feel the need to build a wall. He didn't feel the need to be the strongest thing in the room. As Al finally drifted off to sleep, with Daniel's head resting over his heart, he realized that the nightmare of the cold had finally broken. For 12 years, he had dreamt of gray blankets and frozen alleys, but tonight, his mind was filled with the scent of damp earth and the sight of a riverfront covered in green. He wasn't dreaming of the cold anymore. He was dreaming of the garden Daniel was going to build and the life they were going to live inside it. The announcement of the riverfront contract came like a lightning strike. When the city council had read Daniel Thorne and Associates, Al had felt a pride so sharp it was almost painful. But with success came the vultures. The architectural world was a small, insular circle, and they did not like outsiders, especially those who had risen from the gutter. The Silver Gala was meant to be Al's night, a celebration of his firm's 20 years of dominance. But as they entered the ballroom, Al felt the shift in the air. The whispers followed them like a cold draft. "Look at them," Al heard a woman murmur behind a silk fan. "The iceberg has a new pet. Quite a charity case, isn't it?" Al felt Daniel's hand tighten on his arm. Daniel looked regal in his navy tuxedo, but Al could see the way his jaw was set, the defensive posture of a man who expected a blow. Julian Vane, a man whose family had built half the city's skyline with inherited money and mediocre talent, blocked their path. He held a crystal glass of champagne like a scepter. "Alpheus," Vane drawled, his eyes raking over Daniel with theatrical pity, "and the man of the hour. Tell me, Daniel, is it true you did your best design work on the back of a pizza box while living in a cardboard condo? It's a fascinating narrative, very Cinderella of you." A few people nearby chuckled. Daniel's face went pale, his eyes dropping to the floor for a split second. The old shame, the heavy, suffocating weight of poverty threatened to pull him under. Al stepped forward. The iceberg didn't just return, he expanded. The temperature in the immediate radius seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Julian," Al said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration, You've spent 40 years living in a house built by your father's ghost. You've never had to wonder where your next meal was coming from, which is why your buildings have no hunger. They have no life. They are just expensive piles of stone. Al reached out and took Daniel's hand, lifting it so the light caught the simple silver band Daniel had started wearing. Daniel won that contract because he understands the soul of this city. He knows how the water moves and how the people breathe because he's been close to the ground. He didn't have a head start. He ran the race with weights on his ankles and still beat you. Daniel looked at Al, his amber eyes clearing, the shame replaced by a steady, quiet fire. He turned to Vane. "Mr. Vane," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent circle, "I was homeless. I was hungry. I was invisible. But being invisible is a gift for an artist. I saw the parts of this city you're too afraid to look at. I know where the cracks are, and I know how to mend them. If you call that a charity project, then I feel sorry for your clients. They're paying for a fortress, but they're living in a vacuum." Vane sputtered, his face turning a mottled purple, but no words came. He turned and retreated into the crowd. As they walked away, Al leaned into Daniel's ear. "You were brilliant." "We were brilliant," Daniel whispered back. "Let's get out of here. I'm tired of the ice. I want to go home." The following Saturday, Al woke up to the sound of rain, not the biting sleet of the night they met, but a warm spring downpour. "I want to go back," Al said over coffee. Daniel looked up from his sketches. "Back where?" "St. Jude's, the shelter on 4th. They drove in silence. The building was a grim brick monolith that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 50s. As they stepped into the lobby, the smell hit Al instantly. Bleach, floor wax, and the damp, heavy scent of too many people in too small a space. The director, a weary woman named Martha, recognized Al from the news. "Mr. Thorne, are you lost?" "No," Al said. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket. "I'm paying a debt." Inside was a check for $500,000, the entirety of Al's bonus from the bridge project. "I want new mattresses. I want a modern heating system. And I want every person who walks through that door to get a duvet made of wool, not that gray polyester." Daniel walked over to the communal area. He saw a man sitting on a plastic chair, staring blankly at a television with no sound. Daniel sat down next to him. He didn't offer platitudes. He just took off his own expensive scarf and draped it around the man's shoulders. "It's cashmere," Daniel said softly. "It holds the heat. Don't let it go." As they left, they stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The rain was washing away the grime of the city. "Why today?" Daniel asked. Al looked at the building, then at the man beside him. "Because for 12 years, I ran away from this place. I thought if I built enough towers and made enough money, the cold wouldn't be able to find me. But it did. It found me in that alley with you." Al took Daniel's face in his hands, oblivious to the rain soaking through his shirt. "I realized that the only way to truly stay warm is to share the fire. You didn't just change my life, Daniel. You thawed it." Daniel smiled, his eyes wet with more than just rain. He pulled Al into a kiss that was a promise that the seasons of their lives would always be lived together, rooted in the earth and reaching for the sun. The transition from the city penthouse to their permanent home was not a move of convenience, but one of creation. Al, the man who had built monuments of glass, spent a year designing a structure that felt less like a building and more like an organism. It sat on the edge of the river Daniel was currently restoring, a home of reclaimed timber, local stone, and windows so large the forest felt like an extra room. The night they moved in, the house was empty of furniture but full of light. They sat on the floor of what would be the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and a box of Thai takeout. "I have something for you,"
Al said, his voice echoing slightly against the cedar walls. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy box. Daniel laughed softly. Al, you've already given me a career, a home, and a life. What could possibly be left? Al opened the box. Inside was a key, but not to the house. It was an old skeleton key made of blackened iron. It's the deed to the old textile warehouse behind the alley, Al said. I bought the building. We're turning it into the Thorne Daniels Center. It won't just be a shelter, it'll be a vocational school for landscape design and architecture, for the people the world thinks are invisible. Daniel stared at the key, his breath hitching. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold metal. You bought the alley. I bought the beginning of our story, Al whispered. He moved closer, pulling Daniel into his lap. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure no one has to sleep on that steam grate. But more than that, I want to spend it with the man who taught me that the ground is a place to grow, not just a place to fall. Daniel didn't speak. He simply buried his face in Al's neck, his tears warm against Al's skin. The intimacy that followed was different from any that had come before. It wasn't about discovery or redemption. It was a celebration of permanence. In the quiet of their new home, under the watchful gaze of the oaks Daniel had planted, they became one, not out of a need to survive, but out of a desire to flourish. 10 years later, the morning sun hit the riverfront park with a golden intensity. The oaks were tall now, their branches casting long, dappled shadows over the winding paths. Families walked dogs, children played in the healing gardens, and at the center of it all stood a bronze plaque, designed by Daniel Thorne, structured by Alpheus Thorne. Al, now 42, sat on a bench near the water's edge. His hair was beginning to silver at the temples, but the iceberg expression was gone, replaced by a permanent softness around his eyes. He was watching a group of students from the center sketch the way the light hit the ripples of the river. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a warm, calloused hand that he knew as well as his own heart. The roses are ahead of schedule this year, Daniel said, sitting down beside him. Daniel looked vibrant, his skin tanned from days spent outdoors, his eyes still that same burning amber. Everything you touch grows, Daniel, Al said, leaning in to kiss his temple. We did this together, Daniel reminded him, pointing to a young man in the student group who was wearing a familiar-looking jacket, sturdy, warm, and new. He's our top student this year. He wants to design low-income housing that actually feels like a home. Al watched the boy, a ghost of his younger self, and felt a profound sense of peace. The cold was a memory now, a distant winter that had long since surrendered to an eternal spring. Are you ready to go home? Daniel asked, standing up and offering his hand. Al took it, his fingers interlacing with Daniel's palm. He felt the heat of his partner's palm, a heat that had never flickered, not once in a decade. I am home, Al said. As they walked through the park they had built, hand in hand, the city hummed around them. No longer a cold circuit board of stone and steel, but a living, breathing place of warmth, built by two men who knew that the most beautiful structures aren't made of glass, but of the people who keep the fire burning. Thank you for listening to this story. If you made it this far, I'd really love to know. Where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe for more forbidden cowboy romances, and let me know how you'd rate this story from 1 to 10. Your support helps this channel grow, and it lets me know which stories you want more of. I'll see you in the next chapter.